Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Re-engage webinar entitled Civic Mobilisation in Hybrid Regimes, a transnational perspective on Serbia and Georgia. My name is Pernille Rieker, and I am the coordinator of Re-engage. Re-engage is a Horizon Europe project where we study the state of democracy and democracy promotion in 6 of EU's candidate states, 3 in the Western Balkans, Albania, Bosnia, and Serbia, and 3 in Eastern Europe, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And the aim of the project is to provide the EU with research-based knowledge about the functioning of these regimes that we can all be characterized as hybrid regimes, but also the civil society and the social mobilization in these states. And beyond the aim of providing increased knowledge, our ambition is also to contribute with concrete advice on how the EU should adjust its democracy promotion assistance in order to address the main challenges that these countries are facing. And more precisely, to avoid the tendency that we have seen of stabulocracy and state capture in these states. And in today's event, we will focus on civil society mobilization and more precisely on how grassroots movements in Serbia and Georgia are reshaping civic activism and how it is challenging the existing power structures in these 2 countries. And as you know, mass mobilization against the ruling regime is going on in both countries, and even though they differ, there are also some very interesting similarities in the sense that both mobilizations seem to go beyond traditional opposition parties and civil society organizations. In many ways, they can be characterized as self-organized grassroots movements that challenge existing power structures and in many ways redefine civic activism in hybrid regimes. So what we would like to learn more about in this seminar today is what are the driving forces of these civil movements and how they reshape political participation and democratic engagement. And also perhaps what should be EU's takeaway from this? How can these new forms of mass mobilization be instructive for change in how the EU is promoting and supporting democracy in these states? And to enlighten us on these topics, we are very pleased to have 3 excellent speakers with us here today, who are all 3 part of the Re-engage project. First, Maia Machavariani, Director of Programs, Eastern European Center for Multiparty Democracy, who will talk about civic mobilization in Georgia. And then Luka Filipović, Research Associate at the Institute for Contemporary History in Belgrade, who will give a presentation on civic mobilization in Serbia. And then finally, we have Sophie Gaudet, who is postdoctoral researcher at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and she will give some reflection about the conceptual reflections around these issues, and also make some comparison between the 2 cases and draw on some of the examples that Luka and Maia will provide. So we very much look forward to these 3 presentations, and I would also like to say before we start that while the 3 speakers give the presentation, it's possible to ask questions in the chat. And after the presentation, we will open up for these. So I will repeat these questions and we will have a discussion. So with no further ado, I will give the floor first to Maia. So please, Maia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pernille. Thank you very much. Good day, everyone. My name is Maia Machavariani. Again, I'm representing the Georgia-based Democracy Assistance Organization, ECMD. First of all, I'm very grateful to the Re-engage project for this opportunity to raise the awareness and to address the deeply alarming political situation that exists in Georgia and Serbia today. In case of Georgia, as you all might be aware, Georgia, despite being a former leader in the democratization in the region, has faced dangerous authoritarian backsliding in recent years. And this trend has become even more obvious in the past several months since the October elections in 2024, the parliamentary elections. In today's presentation, I would like to go through the timeline before the elections and after the October elections, as I believe that it is crucial to understand the whole context of the existing crisis that is unfolding in Georgia at the moment. It should be mentioned that among the key issues in current Georgian politics, we see, of course, a very high polarization and social division, both among the political parties and within the civil society. This division is fueled by very powerful anti-democratic propaganda from the government, by the pro-governmental media and pro-Russian outlets. The political landscape in Georgia is dominated by a now already de facto ruling Georgian Dream Party, which exerts excessive control over political processes and the institutions. And all three branches of the government, basically, that is legislative, executive, and juridical, are effectively captured by the ruling party. And in addition, Georgia's political system is increasingly being influenced by the oligarchic interests, by Bidzina Ivanishvili, who is holding absolutely disproportionate power over the political decisions. In terms of the current and immediate challenges that exist in Georgia, as I've mentioned, the past year has been extremely challenging in Georgia's recent history. Although, if you will look at how Georgian Dream has been managing its power over the years, if since 2012 until the recent year, Georgian Dream Party portrayed itself as a balancing power between Russia and the West. However, since the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the discussions about granting the candidacy status to Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, the Georgian government has made a dramatic shift towards a more pro-Russian stance. One of the most concerning developments in the recent past was the attack on the civil society sector and the adoption of the so-called foreign agents law, the Russian law as we call it. This was the second attempt by the Georgian Dream. First, they introduced it in 2023. They couldn't adopt it, but in 2024 they actually did it, which requires organizations to register as foreign agents and effectively labels all civil society organizations as enemies of the nation. But in light of all this ongoing crisis that has been unfolding since, I would say, March 2023, the October 26 parliamentary elections were extremely crucial as a hope and opportunity to change the government and through peaceful elections. And although the October elections, I believe that still exposed just how far Georgia still has to go in terms of democratic development, because despite a very high turnout across the capital, in the regions, among the diaspora, the results were heavily rigged and manipulated by the Georgian Dream Party, which secured in the end 54% of the votes. And the elections were followed by widespread reports of voter intimidation, threat, bribery, especially in the regions. And allegedly, this whole process was conducted in coordination with the Central Election Commission, which unfortunately is acting on behalf of the government. After the elections, the election monitoring organizations, both on the local level and internationally, did not recognize the results as free and fair, calling for a full investigation to uncover the methods that the Georgian Dream used. And until today, none of the Western leaders, except Hungary, has congratulated or recognized the results of the elections in Georgia. Again, at that time, the fifth president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili, alongside with our pro-European, quite a large number of opposition political parties, issued an official statement that they wouldn't recognize the elections and called for mass mobilization and mass demonstrations across the country. And the opposition, it is important that did not recognize the elections. They refused to get into the parliament and they got rid of the mandate. So basically today we have a de facto government, we have a de facto parliament, with only one party represented, that is Georgian Dream. Here I would like to mention very briefly about the opposition, because I think that they are obviously playing a very crucial role in this whole process. Prior to the elections and in the run-up in this very critical period during the adoption of the foreign agenda, political opposition has become quite strong. It's about 8-9 opposition political parties which started to coordinate very actively among each other. They formed coalitions prior to the elections and managed to, if the elections were not rigged, I believe they managed to win these elections as an united opposition. And for the first time, we pretty much saw the readiness of the opposition to work together. But unfortunately, following the elections and during the crisis that is happening today, the opposition has become weak and again more fragmented. This didn't last long, this unity, and we see that the opposition has no specific strategy, they have no plan, and are always reacting to the Georgian Dream's action rather than being proactive. So this is obviously a very weak point in this whole process. And of course, you might be aware that after the elections in November, right after 1 month after the elections, Georgian Dream took a very dramatic step and by officially announced the EU integration process was halted until 2028, followed by non-stop protests and demonstrations in the capital, which were violently dispersed, hundreds of people beaten up, imprisoned and threatened. And despite this very unprecedented violence against the peaceful protesters, the demonstrations have been going on until today. So the demonstrations have been going on for 104 consecutive days non-stop, symbolically in front of the parliament on Rustaveli Avenue. Obviously, we are not seeing 100,000 people on the streets every day for more than 100 days, but this is a very symbolic act by the Georgian civil society to block the road in front of the parliament every night, despite historically very cold winter in Georgia, standing on the street in -10. But we surprisingly and luckily we survived this winter, and now the atmosphere among the civil society is very strong that the spring is coming and the new energy is here. In this whole political turmoil, we see that the main players and the main actors are the Georgian people, grassroots movements and activist civil society that has evolved in Georgia for the past several decades. The past year, and mainly the protests against the foreign agents law, and of course, this dramatic move by the Georgian Dream about the EU integration has triggered a truly unique mobilization among the civil society, not only in Tbilisi, which was a tradition to again gather in front of the parliament in the capital, but there was an unprecedented mobilization across the regions. From my perspective, the weak political opposition played also a role here, because as the population saw, there was no immediate reaction by the political opposition after the announcement of the rigged elections. Unfortunately, there was no very specific action plan that they could introduce to the people. So in the end, civil society took to the streets and the general population took matters into their own hands. And the unique character of this movement lies in the fact that this movement has no leader. It is entirely self-organized and it is spontaneous. If traditionally Georgian people were always looking for some leader, for savior, whether it was Shevardnadze, it was Saakashvili, then Ivanishvili saved us from Saakashvili's regime. But now the reality has changed and we see a fully independent civil society which knows exactly how to organize and how to support each other. And this movement has spread across multiple social media platforms, bringing together more than 300,000 people, and during the crackdowns and of the demonstrations and the mobilization was remarkably strong and high, with various groups organizing support that was providing food, raising funds for transportation from the regions to attend demonstrations in Tbilisi, medical centers, collecting money to cover fines. We until today have a dedicated lawyer groups who are assisting detained and fined protesters, mental health support groups, etc. So it's a fully organized, very self-organized system. And in many ways, the movement has largely overshadowed the opposition. And politicians are not even welcome. If traditionally the politician would go out on the stage and address the population, they're not seen in these protests anymore as speakers, as leaders, and they of course are not taking any role in directing the actions of the people. And it is also important to note that one key strength of the Georgian civil, but of course I would like to mention that this is of course a positive and a negative side. As if the civil society is independent, that is good, and we say that, of course, the civil society has evolved enough to be independent and self-organized. And another positive thing is that the government is not able to target anyone. There is no specific leader they could target and direct any negative campaigns against them. But obviously it has a negative side because obviously we need a political opposition to be strong. If we are asking for snap elections, opposition has to be united, strong, to make sure that if there are elections, we are able to defeat the ruling regime. So it is important also to note that one of the key strengths of Georgian civil society compared to Russia, to Belarus, because we see that the idea is to conduct this Belarusization of Georgia today. But the difference is huge because Georgia has made this very significant democratic progress back in 2003. And compared to Russia and Belarus, the new generation in Georgia has grown up in relatively democratic Georgia. They have always had free visa access to Europe and always had a sense of strong belonging to the European community. And now we are seeing Georgian government just simply taking this away and aggressively employing this Russian-style strategy and playbook, aiming to reshape the mindset of these young people in a very short time. And I'm talking here about 5-6 months, which is obviously hopefully will not be successful, especially in such a rapid period. What, of course, does this say about Georgia and its EU integration prospects? Of course, the existing crisis and the Georgian Dream's actions they created on its own has its own consequences. The adoption of the foreign agents law, which was coupled with the recall elections, violent repressions, and the rest of the peaceful protesters, has put Georgia on a crossroad. If previously our primary concern was the potential of loss of the candidacy status, lagging behind Moldova and Ukraine in EU integration, today's reality is much more difficult and the stakes are much higher. Today, we face a far greater threat, the risk of aligning with Russia and fully losing the EU future and our prospects of EU integration that we have been building for the past 30 years. Well, fortunately, our Western partners are actively supporting the civil society fight that to defend democracy. They have fully isolated Georgian Dream on a diplomatic level, treating it as a de facto government and refusing to recognize it as a legitimate government. And measures include here the US and EU imposed travel sanctions at this stage, but we are obviously hoping for much more severe sanctions against the government. Of course, there is a speculation in this situation that actually the diplomatic isolation is Georgian Dream's objective in a way, because they want to become another Belarus, to be isolated and not to be on a Western radar anymore. And their actions are speaking for themselves, of course. But again, I believe that the sanctions remain the most effective leverage to pressure the Georgian Dream's leadership and potentially to dismantle the system that they have built. As a concluding remark, obviously looking ahead, the current political situation is very uncertain and very unpredictable, unfortunately. We understand that, especially after the US elections, we understand that in today's reality, Georgia is just a very small element in this huge geopolitical game. But the atmosphere in the country is that it's now or never. We have to do our work within the country. We are truly on the edge, and we are on the crossroads, and this is the last chance to defend for us democracy, and we have to fight until the end and protect that we have been building for the past 3 decades. So obviously, yes, in the worst case scenario, of course, the Georgian dream would consolidate power and push Georgia farther from the West and align more closely with Russia. But there is a possibility for obviously a positive shift of civil society and the Western partners to continue to put the pressure on the government and to acknowledge that the elections are the only way out and leading to the snap elections and shift in the political leadership. So on this note, I will end my presentation. Obviously, I will be happy to answer any of your questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Maia. This was really insightful, and I was glad that you ended on a little bit of an optimistic note, that at least we can, it's not only the worst case outcome that is we can also hope for a change. And now I will give the floor, we will continue, of course, the discussion soon, but before we come to the discussion, I will give the floor to Luka to present the situation in Serbia. So Luka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pernille. Well, first of all, for those of you who don't already know, the massive rebellion in Serbia of 2024 and 2025 started when a railway station roof collapsed during a tragic accident that took place on the 1st of November last year, killing 15 people and injuring many more. So the very next day you had demonstrations all around the country, and people were asking for the state institutions to do their job and find those responsible, because the unsaid notion was that the train station roof fell because of corruption and incompetence, both within the government and within the private companies, which were given contracts to reconstruct the train station at Novi Sad. So what happened is, well, in history and political science as well, we are often taught to differentiate between the cause and the reason. The political reason for this massive civil movement was, of course, this massive tragedy. But then you have to look into the causes, the long-term social structural causes, and there are multiple ways that you can go in this direction. Well, first of all, you need to look into material reality, the socioeconomic factor. The living standard of the average Serbian have been decreasing radically over the past 10 years. Some of it is the part of a long-term historical process which has been lasting for the last 30 years. It wasn't just the acceptance of neoliberal reforms in the year 2000. It started back with Milošević in 1991. And the war, the privatization, of course, the culture of corruption that formed around it from the 90s, that wasn't quelled with the democratic reforms in the 2000s. And some may argue that even though some democratic freedoms and liberties were newly gained after the year 2000, some of the things became actually worse for the ordinary guy, because now you have all these new legislation that are actually preventing black market from happening, which many people use to sustain themselves. And of course, you have harsher and harsher reforms of labor legislation every year. And that was a trend which was followed by the shaky democratic coalition up until Vučić rose to power in 2012. This is why we need to remember that Vučić partially rose on a populist promise that he will make things easier for the ordinary people, and he will usher in a golden age of neoliberalism in Serbia, where the money flow will actually trickle down. It never happened, of course. What happened in reality was a decline in living standard for everybody. But we cannot just look at the material factors. There are also quite a bit of potential factors that come from the awareness about the incredible corruption that has been going on. In the words of a famous Serbian sociologist, Jovo Bakic, we always had an unwritten social contract that we all know this country is corrupt, deep to its roots, but we don't talk about it because it's not practical, it's not socially convenient, and we don't have a solution for that. Nobody sees what we can do to combat that problem. So we are just going to accept that every government for the 19th century onwards was corrupt, and this is how things are going to be, basically forever. So what happened then is that people felt that corruption has gone so far up that their everyday lives are endangered. One of the first slogans that students used during the start of their rebellion was, "The steel roof is above all of our heads," meaning that due to corruption and incompetence, any bridge can fall off in any moment, any building can collapse. And so the people felt real existential danger in what happened in Novi Sad. That was a waking call for the masses. And the students were the first ones to articulate all of these animosities that we discussed. They provided a subject through which we can express ourselves. These were the student demands. They were in themselves quite a genius political innovation because they had no presumption of implicit ideological political agenda behind them. They can basically be summoned up to, we are just demanding state institutions to do their job, period. Nothing more, nothing less. They are not raising the question EU or Russia, which is, as you know, the all dividing question in Serbia. They are not speaking about Kosovo, about position of the Orthodox Church, about the rights of LGBT community. None of these issues, which would absolutely destroy the massive movement if they were raised. But they are not being raised until now, and this is why the movement is so successful. Also, as Maia mentioned, another new phenomenon is that they have no organizational structure and no leadership, which makes it impossible for the regime to target certain individuals in the movement. And also, what is interesting to note here, that our students gathered around the institution of plenum. They call it plenum. That's an old socialist tradition of a student assembly, basically, which in socialist legislation used to outrank the elected body of student officials. So they reinvented the plenum as an institution, gave it all the power, and basically it's a new experiment with direct democracy, which has never been seen before. We have direct democracy with hundreds of thousands of participants all around Serbia. We all thought that direct democracy is an excellent solution for a Greek city-state with 10,000 people where everybody knows each other and so on. But now the students, using technology and all the new ideas, managed to bring that concept up to basically an entire massive popular movement. And another thing very interesting to note about the Serbian student demonstration is that they managed to achieve massive public support. In the entire Serbian history from '68, there existed an idea that the students are somehow inherently moral, but that is because of the fact that school in our culture represents an extremely, almost sacrosanct thing, because we don't have many of those. In a land when education is very scarce, you would see why university has such an aura. And another thing to note over there is that we were expecting from '68, back in the 1990s, that students and the universities will bring about the positive change that everybody hoped for. In the 90s against Milosevic and so on and so on. And now finally, but all of these student movements throughout history, they failed. Back in the socialist era, the massive student demonstrations, they failed to gain support of the workers and the peasants. And they failed to interest them in their agenda. Obviously, back then, a life of average worker was exponentially better every year. But then again, in the 90s, we had quite an idealistic dilemma, on the other hand, because the protests were tied up to the civil opposition against the regime of Milosevic. And they were extremely leaning pro-Western, and they were of course, fighting for liberal reforms, which included reforming the economy and so on. And that was a polarizing question, which pushed many people against supporting the students and university professors back in 96 and 97. But now we have a movement without an official agenda, which managed to articulate all the existing animosities for the government, for the economic situation, and so on and so on. Another phenomenon to be noted is the phenomenon of student marches. And that is, I believe, the most important thing. If nothing ever good comes from this demonstrations, at least we saw student marches. That is a new custom where 10 or 20,000 students and people who support them will march on foot from major university center to another one back in the Serbian enormous countryside. They will go through the night under freezing temperatures, through the wind, sleeping in the open, and so on, making a gesture, a grand gesture of self-sacrifice. And what you saw as a result of that gesture was in every village they went through, they were greeted as liberators by the local people. Many of these locals don't understand what's the issue, who's fighting for what's happening in the main political arena in the capital city, but they are welcoming the students, bringing them food, clothes, everything, like they feel sudden urge to participate in popular revolt. And this is where we see the rebirth of solidarity. This is an extremely interesting social phenomenon because we thought that Serbian society became disintegrated over the past 3 decades. And it is extremely important that this happens in Serbia because, as you all remember from the history textbooks, Serbian stereotype was that we have integrated poverty. We were famous for our phenomenon of integrated poverty. That phenomenon was gone after the year 1991, the beginning of the war, the privatization, everything that happened. We basically discounted this new generation. Everybody thought this Gen Z is completely apolitical. They are completely individualized. They have no notion of collective and how they could in this economy with this legislation of work and so on and so on. But then they proven us all wrong by basically restarting the fundamental. If you look at the works of Bowles and Jenkins, the famous American sociologists, you will find that this is that basically the basic fabric of society is solidarity, the notion of collective. We thought that we lost that, and now we have somehow managed to regain that. That is why I say that outcome, political outcome of this demonstration is these demonstrations is not so important as the fact that society is rediscovering itself and its collective spirit. And another thing, when we talk about the uniqueness of Serbian case, of course, and why it's hardly comparable with any other case, is the fact that the international dimension of it is so complex. If you asked the rebelling students to firmly decide whether or not they are in favor of the pro-European future of Serbia, I believe you would get a very disappointing result. And this is because Serbia has these four pillars foreign doctrine, which basically means keeping good relations with Russia, China, European Union, and America at the same time. But what this doctrine does is allow the authoritarian regime to keep its power by playing off the international factors against one another, and also to engage in corruption scandals and affairs with shady foreign companies for all 4 major participant spheres of influence. So basically the problem with getting Serbian people interested again for the European integration is getting them to understand that the notion of participating in European community is not necessarily connected with corruption, which many European institutions turned a blind eye because they claimed Vučić is keeping stabilocracy in the Balkans by simply not trying to invade Kosovo or to claim Republika Srpska, start a new war in the Balkans. And so we are going to support him and to look the other way in regard to matters of corruption. But as this great tragedy in Novi Sad proved, you cannot look away and turn a blind eye to corruption to the extent that it was done. So that would be a suggestion to European policy making. Please reconsider not supporting stabilocracies if you want the promotion of European values to be successful in a country. Another, and I'm going to finish with this because I see that I've taken almost the entire time. Another important thing to be noted about Serbian massive movement is the fact that in rebuilding this stability, the movement completely refused to associate itself with any opposition party, any civil rights organization, and so on. And among other factors, one important aspect of it arrives from the fact that when you do a questionnaire, for example, which is a research that we ourselves did at the Institute, you find out that young people are completely disappointed in mainstream conventional politics. They are completely and utterly convinced that having political parties with representative democracy can only bring about another deeper level of corruption, clientelism, incompetence, and so on. And the students wrote a public letter to the Serbian people the other day, claiming that in order to see a significant political change, the common people need to organize themselves in plenums and thus conduct a direct democracy. And that is the only way basically to win against this regime. And to conclude with this, nobody in the student movement have been commenting on the potential forming of a movement that will beat Vučić in the mainstream elections, because we have completely lost faith in elections because they regularly happen to be stolen. And now basically only the opposition party leaders believe that elections are the way to overthrow the government. But that begs a completely unsolvable dilemma. If we don't go to elections, what's an alternative? A new revolution? Well, that's all nice, but what we are going to do after the revolution, that also raises a question. And then again, you have to wonder, well, basically, how are we going to run the country once we take over? Do we repeat the reforms of the 5th of October? Many people are looking forward for a new 5th October in order to make a liberal dream, what we call the dream of Serbian liberals, the 6th October, a date which never came, when Serbia becomes completely transparent, internationalized, and so on and so on. But the problem with that expectation is that we are basically risking repeating the same situation from the early 2000s with a shaky democratic coalition, which is bound to run itself into the ground. And yet there is very little visible alternative to that occurrence. So we don't know what is going to happen. But to conclude with this, I don't believe that a society who regained a notion of collective solidarity can go too wrong when deciding about these issues. If we are reliving our collective spirit and finally understand it to take one another as a human being and so on, then we are bound to ask ourselves, well, how come we don't have a higher minimal wage? How come we don't have working institutions and so on? We will eventually stumble upon all of these important questions. If we continue developing this solidarity thing, that this is why it's most important not to break the collective movement by asking the collective movement to become institutionalized. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Luka. This was really fascinating, and I really appreciate that you ended on this. That this actually is important in itself. This mobilization and this movement, and we will come back to that, and we will also try to put the two kind of cases here together. And Sophie, you will start with that, and also maybe kind of try to analyze this in a kind of comparative perspective, perhaps, and then we will continue with. I also have some questions, but we will start with you, Sophie, and then we will open up for a discussion. Thank you so much to both of you. And now, Sophie, the floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself, Sophie. Sorry.
Yeah. We said we'll try to avoid that, and of course I didn't. So thank you so much, Pernille, Luka, and Maia, first of all, for bearing with me. Second of all, for putting together this webinar, which I found is extremely necessary in those troubled times. And a special thanks to Maia and Luka for the extraordinary first-hand analysis of the situation in Georgia and Serbia. So the idea behind the seminar and what I will attempt to do in my brief discussion is to offer a transnational perspective on the mobilization. I'll build up on what has been underlined as commonalities between the cases, both in what led to their outbreak, their repertoires of actions, their motivations, and the reaction they provoke within the regime and the society. I think that the conceptual framework of civicness as developed by Mary Kaldor and Henry Radis is extremely relevant here. Civicness is defined as a logic of public authority that speaks to ideas of rights-based, inclusive rather than exclusive political orders, as a form of behavior, acting as if such a logic existed, and as a political position articulated against uncivic politics, in particular the combination of endemic corruption, ethnic or religious sectarianism, and economic and social injustice, which I believe to be extremely relevant and enlightening for both the Georgian and Serbian cases. Especially because adopting such a conceptual framework in trying to bring in a transnational perspective on Serbia and Georgia can really help us broaden our understanding of social mobilization and political contention in hybrid regimes. Because operating from below, civic activism in hybrid regimes act as a check on elites by asking them for accountability and by demanding citizen participation in a political arena that has been so far captured and confiscated from them. As hybrid regimes are characterized by, I quote Tilly and Taro, systematic segments of democratic and non-democratic rule operating side by side within the same regime, civicness and civic activism are a prime systematic segment of democratic rule that defies the hybrid political order and its undemocratic authoritarian tendencies. Civicness is to be understood as a form of mutual obligation and interchange that generate public goods, and we can use it as a paradigm to analyze the mobilization and resistance to the regimes in Serbia and Georgia, as it implies a shared commitment to norms and values that emphasize the public interest. So, civicness and civic activism generate a specific form of public authority in that perspective. A logic that, unlike traditional institutions of power, is not confined to formal structures. It also manifests in informal collective initiatives where citizens take action to address society needs. This logic of public authority fosters cooperation among individuals and groups based on mutual obligation to serve the public good as to define a political marketplace in which undemocratic and uncivic political offer rents in return for allegiance, as in the case in the hybrid regimes in Serbia and in Georgia. And I would start building up on Maia's and Luka's presentation by stressing that in both cases, universal values such as dignity, freedom, and security of one's future the defense of the rule of law have supplemented other revendications coming from the manifestants. Either in Georgia, the non-recognition of the government who was re-elected in power after rigged elections, or in Serbia, accountability for the tragedy of the Novi Sad train station. For example, in Novi Sad, after the incident, the students put forward 4 revendications. The first was for all the documents related to the railway station disaster to be made public. The second was no charges and prosecutions against the students who were arrested while protesting, and charges and prosecution for those who attacked them. And finally, a 20% increase in the state budget for universities. But I think that Luka will agree with me when I say that the mobilization has gone way further than that. And that right now the mobilization is about asking for the regime to be accountable not only for the disaster in Novi Sad, but for years, decades, actually more than a decade, of state capture, misuse of the rule of law, endemic corruption, and massive political repression and political violence. In sum, the regime as a whole, as a system, is denounced, and also the authoritarian exercise of power that has been carried out also in Georgia through repression, corruption, and misuse of the rule of law, has the protest against the foreign engine law, as shown in Georgia. When we were in Tbilisi in October 2024, right before and after the elections, and during, obviously, we had so many discussions with you, Maia, and also with other civic activists who pointed out that there was clearly a continuity between the attempt to pass the foreign agent law and the rigging of the election. That is just a trend of trying to operate an authoritarian sliding more than backsliding, and to put an end to the hybrid nature of the regime by installing a fully fledged authoritarian system. And I would say that the action of the civic activists, both in Serbia and Georgia, is about breaking down the democratic facade behind which the regimes have hidden. And it's about calling for reform of the whole system from below. And this is why I believe that the small concessions that have been operated, for example, by the Serbian government with the resignation of Vučević, for example, did not convince the protesters, or neither did the promise of anticipated elections, because, as Luka already said, it's about a sham that would allow the regime to continue going on without fundamental change or accountability. Yet, this democratic facade is already tremendously weakened in both cases by the completely unhinged degree of violence, brutality, and harassment against the protesters peacefully marching on, standing in the streets. In Georgia, I remember the first protests took place in a very calm and peaceful environment, but a couple of days later, the regime completely brought police and also other informal armed groups in order to repress the protestations. Also in Serbia, you had many occurrences of non-affiliated individuals targeting violently the manifestants, even some of them ending up in the hospital. So even though the regimes use plausible deniability as a strategy, it's really clear that the democratic facade is cracking down because of the democratic push operated by civic activists. I would like to come back to the self-activated and self-organized nature of those movements, which I think that both Maia and Luka have pointed out very nicely. Civic activism reveals the strength of citizen-to-citizen trust in contrast to the degradation of state-society relations and the rule of law. The dynamics of self-activity and citizen-to-citizen cooperation has been solidly enough studied when it comes to Ukraine during and following the Euromaidan and the Revolution of Dignity. Yet, I think that it hasn't been studied enough, it hasn't been applied enough to the cases of Georgia during the 2023 and 2024 protest against the foreign agent law, as well as the anti-government protests that are still happening now. Likewise, I think that this citizen-to-citizen solidarity, Luka, you used the word solidarity, and the self-activation of collective actions says a lot about the nature of politics in both your countries, and how it says a lot about the frustrations of citizens with elite politics. What I've gathered from both your presentation is a defiance against political parties. As Maia has pointed out, opposition parties are more reactive than active and without a clear strategy. As such, civic activism is crucial in filling that void and providing an alternative logic of public authority. I mean, and they do it so well that, to borrow your words, Maia, they have been overshadowing the structured opposition political parties. Likewise, in the Serbian case, the refusal to adopt an ideological framing is surely also maybe a strategy of mobilization, but it also shows that political parties in Serbia have been suspected, I mean, rightfully so, to participate into the system, even political parties that label themselves as opposition party, and to partake in state capture, in corruption, and overall in the impediment of a fully fledged democracy. And this is why I think that it's extremely interesting to also distinguish the civic activism that stems from the current protest, both in Georgia and in Serbia, from the notion of civil society. Those protests are about the everyday practices of civic-minded actors, reaching diverse segments of the society: students, teachers, journalists, public officials even, or sometimes entrepreneurs, who go above and beyond to advance the public interest, which the government is obviously not serving. And the repertoire of actions used in both cases really translate the self-organizing character of the mobilization. Solidarity, trust, and interactions have given impulse to the mobilization, and they are still allowing for them to maintain momentum. The do-it-yourself way of protesting is very visible from your presentation. The providing food, providing transportation, providing reliable information channels, medical centers, collect fundings, opening support groups, like really testifies of this public authority logics that translate into a citizen-to-citizen trust in the name of the public good. And I found also extremely interesting, what you say, Luka, about the plenums as initiatives of direct democracy applied to a mass social movement. Also, the marches in which people offer food, afford, the most basic needs for the protesters, speaks volume about the momentum gained by civic collective actions against a repressive and authoritarian regime. So, to conclude, when the space for democracy is restricted and the political arena captured, confiscated, the role of civic-minded people at all levels, national, regional, even the most local municipalities, the most local communities, even the diaspora. I mean, here in Rome, there were huge protests to support the mobilization in Georgia as well as in Serbia. In Paris, for example, a lot of Erasmus Serbian students have been gathering in front of the universities and have held like assemblies in, this coherent with this popular education tradition to inform and advocate for the protesters. So there is also this transnational networks of support to the civic activists in Georgia and Serbia. And in both cases, the mobilizations have generated what I would call civic ecosystems, meaning self-organizing systems of diverse and interdependent social actors held together by shared civic values. And those ecosystems, they are able to exist and, more importantly, survive in regimes labeled as hybrid, where actually the growing pressure of authoritarianism and the fragmentation of the democratic space is impaired, is embedded by those very same ecosystems. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Very interesting analysis. And now we have 6 questions, but I have a few questions that I just want to start out with based on your presentations now, because it was so interesting to listen to. And I have one question to you, Maia, based on what Luka said, which I would like you to comment on, because Luka, you had this distinction between causes and reasons, which is important, and I think that is also applicable, I guess, to Georgia. That you kind of the explanation of the reasons for this protest, where the foreign agent law, kind of the election, and what happened after that. So if you could say a few words about kind of the causes and the deeper kind of causes for these protestations, which in Serbia, Luka, you referred to the socioeconomic situation, and that has been kind of the deterioration of the economic situation over time, and of course the corruption and everything. And I wonder, Maia, if you could say a few words, if you have some kind of similarities, if you use that distinctions on Georgia.
Sure. I would say that the cause has been piling up over the years. As I've said, this trend of Georgian government being relatively pro-Russian and trying to distance Georgia from the Western integration that started after the start of the war in Ukraine and the adoption of the candidacy status to Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And this trend has been evolving slowly. Afterwards, the specific steps of the government, that was for the first time the attempt of the law on foreign agents, and on the second time the actual adoption of the law. This triggered this wave of civic uprising, and again solidarity and trust and coordination among the civil society. And I would say that this was building up over the years, that little by little, this unity has become bigger and stronger. And surprisingly, even the rigging, the fact of the rigged elections did not bring out that many people outside. For a month, we were, I would say, in shock. Again, we were waiting for the opposition parties to act on our behalf. But when we didn't see that happening, the scene of listening to our prime minister and actually saying, obviously we knew that the integration was stalled, we knew that we were out of the candidacy status and we were behind Moldova and Ukraine, but when people actually saw in live TV, listened to the prime minister saying that it is over and it has been stopped until 2028, I remember my phone starting to collapse, because the only text that I was reading was that we are not waiting for parties. We are, in 10 minutes, I'll be on Rustaveli. This triggered this huge mobilization. The platform was already there. This previous crisis has created this social media platforms where people could interact easily. People who didn't know each other, but 200, 300,000 people were already in contact with each other. And in seconds, I could see that the comments were, we are outside, we have to defend ourselves, we are not waiting for anyone else. So I think that this trend has been evolving over time, but I would also say that it hasn't been done like Putin did in Russia, when he took about 10 years, to work on, again, adoption of the law, impacting the overall mentality of the young people, etc. This happened in several months. So this has been building up in a very short time, and this anger and this feeling of mistrust against the government, of course, was there. So the trigger was actually to listen and to watch the prime minister saying that it's over, and that was it. So even the elections and the rigging did not bring out people, surprisingly for me, actually.
No, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I will now move to the questions, and then I will come back with some questions. There's an additional question from my side, but we have a question here from Christian. How significant is the center periphery model in Georgia, considering how people view the West and on the other side Russia? And can we expose some differences in approval ratings for EU membership? And this is an interesting question on the center periphery dimension that I think maybe could also be interesting to hear your views on, Luka, how that plays out in Serbia, because that might be a difference as well, the center periphery. So maybe, but Maia, you can start, since the question was specifically for Georgia.
Well, according to the recent polls, 80% of the Georgian population is pro-European. The large cities are very active, and this demonstration showed that this was not only in the capital, but the largest cities, the small cities were also very active in support of this whole protest. And I would say that obviously the propaganda is huge. It is very difficult to go against the huge machine of propaganda that Georgian Dream has, with unlimited resources and unlimited financial resources that they have, and administrative resources. Unfortunately, they are also working very well in terms of impacting and influencing the local population, especially in the region. And I think that one of their main weapons here is poverty, because the poorer the population is, especially in the regions, the easily it is to influence them. And they created, I would say, fake jobs, some very minor financial support that they provide that still gets their votes by bribing, by threat, etc. So in terms of mentality, I would say that majority of the Georgian population is pro-European. And I would like to here draw a very brief parallel with Moldova, which is surprising that in Moldova, despite their very rapid pro-European integration, half of the population is still pro-Russian, and it's a much bigger problem for them to actually, even the referendum showed this issue. But in Georgia, a majority of the population is definitely considering themselves as part of the European community, but the propaganda is very strong. They need time, obviously, to fully influence this majority of the population with things otherwise. But at least today, hopes are quite high that we are still on a European side, even in the regions.
Thank you so much. Luka, before I give the floor to you, there is an additional question for you that I just will read up. What is the role of the oppositional political party, the Green Left Front? And I guess that is in Serbia. Yeah, the Green Left Front. That is a Serbian party, yeah,
Indeed.
in the demonstration and in the blockade. So the role of the Green Left Front, so if you can say something about that, and also the center-periphery kind of distinction in Serbia, if that applies to Serbia as well. Go ahead.
Well, when the Green Left Party was first formed a few years ago, we had great expectations of it because it wasn't at first in any way connected with the parties from the previous shaky democratic coalition, which ruled from the year 2000 up to 2012. And a lot of people in Serbia, myself included, are inclined to blame the coming of Vučić on the mistakes made by the Democratic Coalition. The thing is that Green Left Party was a new phenomenon, and they chose to abstain from associating themselves, and the parties of the traditional opposition, the former Democratic Coalition, they have another problem, which is also relatable with the socio-economic factor, and this is the fact that they are mostly comprised of politicians from the richest and most urban areas of the center of the Belgrade city. Now, obviously, that kind of political marketing is not going to resonate well with the majority of Serbian voters, even at the periphery of the capital city, and so on. And the problem is that these worlds that exist in Serbia were becoming more and more apart as the decades wore on from the 1991. And people who are engaged in politics themselves, Vlado here present can testify about that because he knows a lot of Serbian politicians personally, are living more and more in their own reclusive social circle. And they are only expressing values and ideas that are acceptable in their immediate social habitat, which doesn't necessarily says anything to the rest of the population. And that is a big problem for any party of the Serbian opposition. But we had very great expectations of the Green Left Front because we thought that they are finally going to bring up new ideas to overcome that problem. Even many far leftists who are traditionally disappointed with the institutional policies were surprisingly favorably optimistic about the Green Left Party, which wasn't expected. Of course, as you all well know, in Serbia, the ideological divisions of the 20th century are still strong. So already when you add a green prefix to the leftist party, you are expecting them to be left-wing liberals at best, very close to the political center, which traditional Serbian leftists, of course, are going to despise. But the problem with this is that this Green Left Party over time began to be more and more associated with traditional opposition center, gathered around the personality of Vučić, demonized number 2, Dragan Đilas. Now you have to remember one thing. On one side, you have the Atorian's regime propaganda that is bound to present the former Democratic Coalition as being absolutely fathers of corruption in Serbia and so on, exploiters of workers. There's a great deal of populism to that. But then again, you have a fact that Dragan Đilas is indeed a billionaire, running for an office in a country where average wage used to be 300 euros up until a few years ago, and now it's a bit higher, but the spending power is much shorter. So it's even worse now. And when you have a billionaire as your opposition candidate, that is not going to bring you many points overall. And the problem with the Green Left Party is that they associated themselves heavily over time. But I have an understanding for that because they sat in parliament with the regular opposition every day, and they got targeted. They got even violently assaulted by the members of the ruling coalition. That exposure to such an experience brings people together. So it's no wonder that Green Left Party over time extended its hand towards the traditional opposition. And just to finish up with this, but the violence, I see somebody mentioned in the comments, the violence in the Serbian parliament. The thing about that is, as far as the main opposition is concerned, it may be one of two things. Some parties and leaders, and I believe Green Left is among them, are genuinely wanting to see a rebellion taking place in the parliament. But many opposition leaders are only seeking the recognition from the student and from the public movement, which is itself proven by the fact that they have been in the same parliament for years. And they were in power for 12 years before Vučić came to power. Never before they have thought about taking some radical stance on basically any issue whatsoever. And now they cause this massive scandal, which can also be then interpreted as a populist try to get closer to the popular revolt and basically to become the leaders of it, right? And it only counter-fired. That is the problem. That only made it harder for student protesters to reach compromise with the civil opposition, because the day after that violence in parliament, the student plenums decided to revoke any connection they previously may have had with opposition, to distance themselves from the civil opposition, and so on and so on. That's the problem. And there is no way to overcome that problem now, unfortunately. No visible way, at least. Please continue.
Yes, I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry. Yeah. So the other question, you have perhaps responded to it a little bit, because how this there is a question here from Andreas that whether the protest movement, if they continue to avoid a leadership, then kind of how will, I mean, will they manage to bring about political change or lasting political change? I mean, so that's I guess that's the main part of the question, if that is possible, or if at some point you need some kind of political leadership in the protest movement.
Indeed, the real question here is whether or not this tension that is being created by the protests are going to wear itself off at a certain point. That's the biggest dilemma in regard to that. Because if we are going to see a gradual losing of interest in continuous blockades, and that is, by the way, exactly what regime is playing at. Now, this is the crucial thing to understand the future of this protest, is to see that the strategy of the regime is to create a new reality, where every day you have massive demonstrations, all the universities are under blockade and most of the high schools, but nothing ever happens, and nobody cares for the fact that we don't have a working educational system no more. Now, if this tension is to wear off at some point, that could be potentially a doorway for making some sort of an arrangement with the civil opposition. But on the other hand, that would be extremely dangerous arrangement, because, as I mentioned earlier, now you risk losing a popular support. And so which card do you play then? Many scholars believe that it would be the best for the students to found their own political movement. That has been discussed rather fearsomely in Serbia, because now you have to ask yourself a question, well, even if they win, what happens? Can we really have a 23-year-old running the Ministry of Finance? On one hand, you have that critical question, and on the other hand, you have a critical question of what does that speak about us if we are going to have 20-year-olds fighting our battles instead of us? When I say us, I mean the collective Serbian society. And these are the two questions that have been really plaguing the entire public for a time. So the concrete answer is we don't know, but based on everything we see by now, it is very unlikely that this movement will ever produce an organized leadership structure or join in coalition with the civil opposition. So it is either plenum and a form of a revolution through plenum, which is the idea that although it is dangerous, it is maybe the best choice we have right now, or we let the regime imposes this new reality and then we wait for elections and nothing happens in elections and so on. But just to, when speaking about the uncertainty of the future, I see a question here, very interesting one, that asks us what do we predict on the 15th of March? And that is where basically the question proposed by Andreas will also be answered. We have all the major scenarios ranging from Tiananmen. We, by the way, expect that it is highly possible that Vučić will bring out the heavy guns. And then we also expect that it is possible to have this massive protest, the biggest in Serbian history, and the government just chooses to ignore it. And we have all the potential options in between tanks on the streets, and in between basically nothing happens.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe Maia, maybe you can say something about the similar situation is in how that it plays out in Georgia, because there also the opposition do not have kind of a leading figure, and so how does that play out in Georgia? Oh, and then you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I think in the end, despite this very positive change in the evolution of the civic opposition and this whole mass mobilization that exists and this unity and solidarity among the population, we still need opposition political parties, because in the end, if the main request and demand of the protest is snap elections, we need political parties to participate in the elections. Yes, the demonstrations have no leaders, but in the end, we still need a leader, because in order to, I mean, this is not a very short protest, right? It has been going on for over 3 months, and in the end, we need structure, we need some coordination, and we need a plan. So I think that in our case, still we have the Georgia's 5th president, Salome Zurabishvili, who's played this very important role in uniting political opposition. The meetings are happening on a weekly basis among she's gathering opposition, and now we have the upcoming also the local elections. So I think that in the end, opposition, yes, it is weak, but in the end they will coordinate again, and yes, I mean, there is no way out without the political opposition, obviously, but the strength of the civil society and their full inaction and engagement in the political processes obviously helps for political parties to become stronger and to respond to what are the needs of the civil society at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then we move on to a question about how this protest and manifestations, how that affect the EU, the path towards EU in both of these countries. So maybe you can say something about that. Of course, it has slowed down the Georgian path towards the EU. So how is that what can it result to in Serbia? Because there's a huge difference between the public opinion polls about how the citizens view Europe. Of course, it's over 80% positive in Georgia, and I think around 40 only in Serbia. So it's a huge difference. So maybe you can say something about that, how this will affect or is likely to affect this. Both the opinion polls and also the path. And I also would like you to say something about what kind of advice, because you mentioned that, Luka, when at the end of your presentation, that what the EU should probably, how they should change their approach to Serbia and probably also to Georgia is to kind of put more emphasis on civil society and maybe do not, because until now it has unfortunately supported the state capture and the stabiliocracy. It has not been the intention, I guess, by the EU, but that has been the result. So maybe you can say something about that as well. And then maybe who would like to start?
I can start.
Yeah.
So I would say that first of all, obviously, wherever we are today, it is fully based on the actions of the Georgian government, and there is another connection between the EU and people. We saw that even after the first attempt of the adoption of the first law on foreign agents, and when the European Union saw the actions and this mobilization of Georgian people to protect their EU integration process, the statements by the EU members and the EU leadership was that the candidacy status was granted not to Georgian government but to Georgian people. So that's why I would say that the protests are not halting the EU integration; they are bringing us closer to EU. The more we are out on the streets, the more closer we become to EU, and people have become the face and the symbols of, and then you've seen, I'm sure, the pictures of women with EU flags, and these protests are bringing us definitely closer to the EU, despite the actions of the government. And the candidacy status that was granted was as a result of the initial protests, and the protest that has been happening after the elections. They resulted again in the fact that no one in the European Union recognized the results of the elections. They're listening to Georgian people rather than to the Georgian government. So I think that, again, I would say that the protests are bringing us closer to the EU, but obviously the actual steps of the government, in that case, I would say that I have no hope at the moment that the government will change its direction. I think they've made a very drastic decision, and they know, unfortunately, what they are doing, and they are going straight. And unfortunately, there is no other way back to the EU in this government that we have, unfortunately.
Could you maybe also add on if you were to give one advice to the EU on how to kind of change their approach, maybe to what would be your advice to kind of the opposition? And yeah.
Yes, I think the only way out, and I'm not sure if it's going to work or not, but definitely a stronger sanctions on all members of the Georgian Dream Party and the government is the only way out, both from the EU, UK, US, to dismantle the system they have. The lower level members of the system, when they are affected by the sanctions, when they really feel the actions of the Western allies on themselves, then the system starts to dismantle. Otherwise, and again, I'm not sure when the government has made this drastic decision to become an authoritarian regime and the declared dictatorship, they might not back up. But at least when the system gets weaker, in the end, this affects the whole management of the authoritarian government they have now. So I think that sanctions, unfortunately, are the only way out. And again, people standing on the streets and showing that we're still fighting until the end. And unfortunately, we see these two options at the moment.
Yeah, I see. Thank you so much. And Luka, what about Serbia?
Well, we can actually connect this to the previous question. If we had such a strong, impactful idea about the future of this protest, if we had an idea that this protest is actually about the future of our country, in a sense, European Union versus Russian vassal, then we could see actually popular revolt and bourgeois opposition getting together on this issue, and so do everybody else involved in the matter. But the problem is that you cannot raise any question that is such polarizing and as this one in a society like Serbia, like in a social reality. As it is in Serbia today, when you speak about public opinion over European Union and Russia, you need to remember that we don't have any reliable statistical polls. And that is in itself a very interesting phenomenon, because if you ask a common guy on the street, is he pro-European or pro-Russian? Most of the time, he's going to say, I'm for both. I'm for both good relations with Russia and EU, and I don't see any conflict in that statement. There are a multiple factor equation that influence that. For example, the legacy of Yugoslav non-alignment, which Vučić is trying to replicate by the 4 pillars of his foreign policy. Then, of course, you have the animosities stating back to the bombing of 1999 and the wars of Milošević. And then again, you have tremendous impact of Serbian pro-Russian propaganda from the basically 19th century onwards, when there existed an idea that Russia is a distant savior from the imperialism of both the Germans from the north and the Turks from the south. And that sort of an idea stays with people for generations. They are looking towards a big brother in a distant, which is unfortunately the big brother is only using them for his own economic and political, especially military interests. This is what personally myself and many other people around me are afraid of, that Putin is going to pull a trick on Vučić to get himself a better deal over Ukraine. He's going to convince him to make some sort of a radical move in the Balkans, which is going to create tension here and relieve tension for the Russians in Ukraine, because this is what Russians actually did in the Great War of the Balkans back in 19th century before the Vienna Congress. They pushed Serbia into war and then created the Greater Bulgaria, for example. But majority of Serbian people will never see that image of Russia, but will only have the image of Black Brother. But on the other side, the European Union is not contributing too much by supporting stabilocracy, and especially by turning a blind eye to corruption. And that is the advice for the EU policy making. If you want to reach to the Serbian peasant and worker, please stop giving advices from the position of comfort. That is what is extremely insulting for average Balkan's mind. You see, there is a thing in our culture called inat. You cannot have a literal translation of that word. It's basically spite, but it's much more to it. It's, if you are forcing me to do something, now I'm becoming radically against it, even though I wouldn't be on my own devices, but I'm doing that in spite of you forcing me to do this and that and so on and so on. So basically, when you tell from a position of having institutionalized state and democracy and everything, you tell Serbian people, well, you need to listen to your institutions. They have a strong tendency to then claim, but are these institutions going to continue helping your foreign companies to exploit us, and so on and so on? This increases, this reality of economic exploitation basically exists. It's also, as the matter of corruption from earlier, an unspoken reality. We all know that we have to pay the price for international integration, and that price has to be paid in letting the foreign economic interest in. But the problem is that many liberal politicians in Serbia would now claim you have a way to do it with regulations which will prevent your land getting destroyed by Rio Tinto company, for example, which is internationally famous for destroying the environment everywhere they have dug, and so on. And Rio Tinto lobby has a strong presence within EU institutions themselves. And when you say you have a population which is generally aware of that fact as well. So what you need to do, you need to make them aware that Europe is not always your enemy, as well as Russia is not always your friend. And only then you can try to have them understand the position of a small state in a complex geopolitical arena, and to accept the reality that Serbia is, after all, geographically situated in Europe. So despite the wishes, maybe of general population, to be outside the international system, gradually you will have to accept one international system. And this is why we need to understand that it is much more favorable to accept the international system where the rule of law is still an idea, even an abstract one, even the one not realized in material reality at all, but it still exists. Then to accept to be a part of the world with Putin and Comrade C and so on, where such a concept is treated as a form of imperialist European propaganda and so on and so on. And I would end with that.
Thank you so much, and that was very important comments that you make here. I would just end with one question to you both, because of course this beginning of 2025 has been quite rough in international politics, and of course with the change in administration in the US and all the things that have happened. I mean, it's happening day by day. We have new things to relate to, and we don't know what will happen tomorrow. So in these uncertainties, how do you think that will affect both the kind of mobilization and the protest that you have in your country, but also the kind of the likelihood of them succeeding, and also the path towards the EU? So if we could end a little bit on a few reflection on both, and maybe Sophie, you want to comment on that as well towards the end, and then we have to end the webinar. But start with you, Maia, maybe.
Well, as I've said, it's very, very uncertain what will happen in Georgia. And as I mentioned in my presentation, I personally realized that we're this very tiny spot and element in this very huge geopolitical game. And the discussions in the country have been that, yes, things are happening around the world, and there will be some reconfiguration in the geopolitical world, but we have to continue what we have started. We have no other way just to give up. I mean, we have this only chance to protect our democracy and to protect our sovereignty and our country. So the fight will continue. And despite the international configuration, I don't think that anything will change within the itself. So the atmosphere and the spirit is to protect what we have been working on for the past 3 decades.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And Luka?
To be quick, because I took a rather long last time. The thing is that basically I can end up with what I continuously keep saying to professors and administration at the Belgrade University. We need to understand one thing, and that is that in the international system, you have people that you can connect and protest with. For example, if you are a part of a larger international system, then you can join up with the Spanish leftists, with the French communists, with the Green Left of Germany, and then protest imperialist capitalism from that position. But if you are not a part of such a system, then it's extremely easy for almost a feudal-like reproduction of social classes to take place in an authoritarian political system like Vučić was trying to create until now. Now, the danger, of course, is, as now Vlada in the audience is probably cursing at me for not mentioning this, but the danger arises from us becoming a form of European Belarus. That is the fact. People often forget that you can be a Belarus on the fringes of the democratic world, which is ready to allow you to remain as such, as long as you don't disturb the stabilocracy of the region. And the best way to combat that is exactly what the students now are doing. And they are claiming, let's re-engage with the civil society. We already have the rebuilt notion of solidarity and so on, and make society its own assurance against tyranny. So in order for EU to change its outlook in Serbia and be more successful, it should support exactly that kind of an idea. create a new political culture based on collectivism, based on civil activism, promote that instead of promoting stabilocracy in the region. And that would be it. That's
perfect, Luka. This is really a good advice, and you also managed to use the word re-engage, which is the project, and that made very much sense. And this is good advice, and we are supposed to give advice to the EU in this project, so that's perfect. But Sophia, I would like to give you the floor towards the end now to come up with some reflections after you have listened to the discussion.
So I'm not known among my friends, family, and colleagues for my unhinged optimism. So I'll be coherent. I'm afraid that in a world where we are witnessing a structural phenomenon of fragmentation of power structures, fragmentation of the rule-based international order, that we are seeing the fragmentation of what we had been taking for granted as, as the function, the quotidianity of international politics. I think that the context is extremely favorable to regimes like the Georgian and the Serbian ones, because we are, we work with the Reengage, second time, we worked on a phenomenon of democratic backsliding in Western Balkans and the Eastern neighborhood. But I think also one of the reasons why the EU might not be able to bring the wind of change, to support, not to bring, but to support the wind of change in the two countries, is because the EU is democratic, not the EU, but within its member states. You have also a rather structural phenomenon of democratic backsliding, and this needs to be addressed, because we have, I'm not going to name names, but we have so many EU member state leaders that are right now taking slightly light-handedly the rule of law and the very basic principle of democracy. And I think this creates a favorable environment for authoritarian regime to survive and to strengthen their authoritarian exercise of governance. Yet, I think that the huge resolve that has been shown by protesters in both countries remains a source of, I'm not going to say a hope, because that's not a word I use out of principle, but of optimism, in the sense that, and it's just not to be cheesy and to close the seminar on a joyful note, it's really because I think that it was not a force that was expected. We have taken for granted so many things, but the mobilization, the massive high-scale mobilization of grassroots movements from below, based on principles of solidarity and trust, has been completely overlooked in the past decades. Why? Because it has been, purposefully avoided. And if we speak of other countries that are re-engaged case studies, like Bosnia-Herzegovina, in 2014, the EU missed a huge momentum to support change from below and to support anti-nationalist politics and to really bring about a fundamental change in the country. And quite the contrary, it backed up really the usual suspects. So I think that the possibility for the change to come from below has been completely ignored. And maybe it can come because what I see from both presentations is the fact that the only system left of check and balance in Serbia and in Georgia is actually civic mobilization. So maybe it's the fourth in domestic politics, but also in global politics that we need to acknowledge. And I completely agree with Luka that opposition to authoritarianism needs to be transnationalized, internationalized, and that the more we connect those movements, the more they are likely to become major game changers.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thanks to all of you. I think that we can end on a slight optimistic note that at least this civic mobilization in both countries is extremely important, and also that this is actually something that EU or other external actors should support. So I fully agree with all of you on that, and I think that is good to at least. We need to kind of end on an optimistic note, even though in the world today it's a bit difficult at times. But thank you so much to all three of you for very good presentations. Thank you to the audience for very good questions. And yeah, I think we end here. So goodbye.